Hello, everybody. I'm going back on this thing. This is Tod Williams. I'm here with friends of mine talking a little bit about the Barnes Foundation and its legacy of stone work. Missing from this talk are many, many people. One of them is certainly Billy Chen, my partner, right? But also other people who were absolutely instrumental in making sure this was a success. Aileen Roberts, the head of the building committee, with her great wisdom and support and great good sense and taste were critical, but there are many, many others. However, there are three basic groups here, and I wanted to introduce Phil Ryan, who was our project manager and project architect. He'll be hopefully inserting his voice whenever he can. ABC Stone, who we've loved for a number of years, John Taranto and Saretsky, they were absolutely instrumental in helping us to find the right stone and source it, and in a way, find a way to actually tool the stone and deliver it. And then Mike Picco, who, without whom we wouldn't be able to, we simply have no idea of the real, I certainly have no idea of how to basically make this stone work well on building and how to handle it. We've worked with Mike on a number of projects and we're very, very happy. It's very sophisticated and important part. If everyone could mute, we'll try to get through this in timely fashion. But I think everyone has something to show and tell. So I'll start out for the first few minutes on this and try to advance the slides. And unfortunately, the first one doesn't advance. The Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. This is a project we got in 2008 and was completed in 2012. It was an unusually fast project. And it also came with a very, very difficult and interesting history. Dr. Barnes, shown here, was born poor in Philadelphia, but was a very bright and tough guy who amassed a huge fortune. And he approached middle life, he began to realize how important art was to him and to his real interests. He worked with John Dewey to establish a philosophy of his ideas of art and art collection. They were basically to indicate that all people are capable of understanding art and that art can in fact be made by all people. So part of his collection that he amassed, which is worth billions of dollars today, you can see the Van Gogh on the left, but we can see Native American tapestry, rugs on the right, African artifacts, and even hardware. He didn't relegate one thing as being more important than the other. However, he did start his collections largely with Impressionist art. He hired Paul Kray to make a home gallery for him. This is something that some people are doing today, but this was in around 1920, and he lived in a building adjacent and connected to this space for years. And although you can see it has windows, eventually the art that he collected, the windows all needed to be closed. But you can see how he's hung the art, which is in an ensemble style without information, so that people would use your eyes to find their way and to, in a way, learn to see in a more rich and complex way. In this case, it's bilaterally symmetrical, so that if we see one artist on one side, we'll see the same artist on the other in general. And or the form might be the element that attaches itself from one side to the other, or it could be a dialogue within the hardware. He lived in Marion, Pennsylvania, in an arboretum with his wife, and he wanted every person to be able to see this art, particularly those who were not educated. He was and were not sophisticated. He welcomed people of all colors and all interests, but particularly those who were not pretentious and or quote experts. Of course, Dr. Barnes had a little pretension there himself as the expert, but in time, this wonderful location in Marion became actually a place where largely wealthy, white, often women and men would come because in fact it was embedded in a very, very rather fancy suburb, and it was not an easy place to get to. And Dr. Barnes, who died in 1950, was not there to help to try to make sure that all people came to his collection. And it suffered, and it suffered sufficiently that they began to go broke. Dr. Barnes didn't allow his paintings to be photographed. He didn't want the paintings to be traveling. They had to remain there, and because it was in a very, very specific and small location, his will, which was that they not be moved, actually became a kind of trap for the Barnes Foundation. And eventually, in dire financial straits with few people coming there, poor conservation practices, they appealed to the city of Philadelphia, and in a difficult lawsuit, but one that was won by the Barnes Foundation, they moved down to the Franklin Parkway. We can see on the lower right, which is where most of the cultural institutions in Philadelphia are collected. In fact, the site that he was given was the site of a children's house of detention, actually an interesting building architecturally, but it was so mute on the parkway that the only people that were living in the park at that area were the homeless. And it was a very sad and actually a rather harsh existence for the kids who were there. Eventually that was given over to the Barnes Foundation for $1, and a new facility was made in more closely aligned to the land and landscape. But nonetheless, there were plenty of protests. They believed that moving the Barnes to Philadelphia, breaking the will, was so far against the will and wishes of Dr. Barnes, they felt it was wrong. In a way it was, but in a way it wasn't, because Dr. Barnes was really very interested in having people, as I said, of all color and all ethnic persuasions to come to his museum, all abilities. We came to the project, Billy and I and Phil, with an idea that the gallery was in a garden in Marion, Pennsylvania, which is where it was. And even though we were bringing it into the city, we wanted to make sure the garden was in a gallery and the gallery was in a garden, so we would have a both-and situation. We believe that Dr. Barnes was both an elitist and a person who was really, really interested in the populist culture. This was an early model. By the time we had made this model, which was both the image before was at the time of our interview, we were really simply describing ways by which we could think about the building. The next image shows Paul Cray's plans. There were 22 rooms or 22 galleries. Every one of them hung with with a total of more than 2,000 paintings and artifacts, and they needed to remain intact. And you can see that we analyzed the plans and then found that we could split the plan open and make the building accessible, which it was not, and bring light and air into the building and create a better gallery experience. We had a great client, and they were very comfortable with us showing them our sketches and struggles. And eventually we resolved, working with Lori Olin, a plan that integrated not only the original galleries, but all of the necessary functions for the new Barnes collection. And here it is on the Philadelphia Parkway. So this is really the beginning of why stone. As you can see, the Parkway actually is largely limestone buildings. The last of the buildings were built in the 20s before the Barnes Foundation came in. You see the Franklin Institute on the lower left, Indiana limestone, the Philadelphia Free Library, also Indiana limestone, and the Philadelphia Museum of Art in the distance of either Mankato or stone. So limestone was the material, and we believed that it should be a stone that felt comfortable but different from stone on the parkway. We're really going to show you a few glamour shots. You can see here that the building is a tapestry of stone. We'll get to that in a moment. It's largely solid, or apparently solid, on the outside, that you enter it in a way by which you're meandering through the landscape, which is what happened in Marion, Pennsylvania. You can see the free library in the back. And I think Phil may begin to talk at this point. I wanted to go back to the previous image and show first an image of kente cloth on the upper left, a model that we began to make so that we felt that the building would be wrapped in a fabric, not a neoclassical wrapper, but in a fabric of cloth. So Phil, do you want to start talking and taking over the slides at this point?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, something may have just, I apologize, the presentation went through, flipped over, but Greg, why don't you just advance the slides? It looks like Greg's just loading that up. So just to follow up on what Todd was saying, and just also just to add in that DM Sabia was also a fantastic partner in this, who worked with Picco and the construction manager, Elif Driscoll. And what was interesting about our relationship with DM Sabia, the mason who actually hung the stone, is they had done a previous project with us at Sperkanish Hall at the University of Pennsylvania. So there was actually kind of a conversation that evolved and continued at the Barnes Foundation that allowed us, I think, to achieve a lot of the quality that we were able to get. So as Todd was saying, with the development that Todd and Billy felt very strongly about using the kente cloth, it was actually a response in some ways to the collection by Dr. Barnes, in which he had actually collected some African art. Two of the main pieces by Matisse, which really kind of formed the core of the collection. Matisse also collected these African cloths, the kente cloths and the kuba cloths. And so it became a moment where the director really encouraged us as the design team to find ways of injecting these kind of African motifs into the design of the buildings, as he had done with Cray out at the original facility in Marion. And so what you see on the screen right now is some relief model studies that we did. One of the challenges, of course, with designing a large contemporary building, as say compared to the neoclassical neighbors at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the Franklin Institute, and the Philadelphia Free Library, which is on the next slide, those buildings are able to rely on neoclassical orders, right, that enable us to break down the scale of the building, really in order to sort of give it a kind of sense of scale and humanity. And so we spent a lot of time beginning to look at stones and ways of varying the cadence of the stone to help break that scale down. And I think in doing so, it also enabled us to have conversations with ABC Stone, which is on the next slide, where ABC very happily delivered lots of large samples to us, and we were able to begin looking at quieter and sort of more vibrant stones that could literally start to suggest the notion of the threads of the fabric, if you will, the kente fabric. And so we began to play around with bronzes, stainless steels, stone reveals, started to think about the thickness of the stone, and how we could start to inject this depth and texture to help produce the tapestry, or the fabric, if you will, of the facade. There's also sort of a wonderful allusion to the ornamental metalwork that adorns the walls of the galleries. Dr. Barnes really believed in a sort of merging of the craft of the professional or the master painter, as well as the craft of the common craftsperson, right? So the collection actually has hinges and tools and beautiful pieces of inlaid furniture, and even a sort of sculpture of a wonderful bird made out of clamshells, right? This kind of very high-low art. And so we began to look at the stone and the metalwork as a way of sort of alluding to that composition on the walls of the gallery. These are some images that we took actually on Central Park South of these large slabs, looking at different stones from Turkey, from Israel, even from Tennessee, with a Tennessee pink marble that is the floor of the Philadelphia train station. And then if we advance to the next slide, the Barnes, in really wanting to push this project forward in a pretty aggressive way, I think, Todd, you'd probably agree with that. They had frankly been under so much litigation and stress over the act of moving the collection that we said, okay, look, we're more than happy to work hard, because this is an amazing project and an amazing problem, but we also need to be able to get you on board with some of these decisions. And so the construction of full-scale mock-ups from literally building a full-scale art gallery in North Philadelphia to test out the lighting and the glass composition and everything. We also did these full-scale mock-ups of the stone on the site, roughly in line with the facade of the south elevation of the building. And so what you see here going from left to right is the Ramon Gray, which is ultimately the selected stone with a stone reveal. You see the Tennessee pink marble, which is the second from the left with stainless steel reveals. You see a Turkish limestone called seagrass, which is the third. And then on the fourth, on the right, it's actually the same Ramon Gray, but it's heavily sandblasted, which ended up kind of robbing it of all of its beauty. And in the end, we went with a sort of combination of the Ramon Gray with a stainless steel reveal. So we can just advance to the next slide. I think the next one is actually Todd, not quite wrestling the trustees to the ground, but sort of working to kind of convince them of the vision that Todd and Billy had for the project. And I think one of the key elements of that was actually expressing the thickness of the stone, right? Being able to give the building this weight, this gravitas. There really was never any question about building the building out of anything other than stone. And I think this was one of those key conversations where we're bringing the client physically to the site and really letting them see it in the sun as the sun moves around the panels. I think we were probably on site, Todd, for maybe an hour or two on this particular day, and we would revisit it for about another 3 or 4 months after that. Do you want to add anything to that, Todd?
Cover the panels, because although we were interested in we just didn't want to get everybody's opinion on this, but rather a good cross section of the people who were really going to pay for it and who were concerned with the of the building and the museum or the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the next sequence of shots really just has to do with one of the things that Todd and Billy really having grown up as an architect in their office and now working in my own studio, I feel the same way with the people that work for me, but listening to the craftspeople is an incredibly important part of the process. And so first listening to ABC Stone, who was helping us find stone, then listening to Picco and ABC Stone, and DM Sabia and Driscoll. And actually, we believe in going all the way to the fabricator. And so traveling to Israel and the West Bank. So the stone is actually quarried in southern Israel in the Negev Desert. We tried to keep it competitive. And so we actually went over there to interview 2 different sets of stone fabricators and finishers. And through that process, just advancing maybe through each of the slides, we can probably just move through them, Greg. We were able to also visit the old city of Jerusalem. We can literally go to the Wailing Wall and sort of see this remarkable edifice where people bow their head and pray, as well as walking through the old city and seeing just kind of the wear on the old roadways that were literally built by the Romans. That kind of history and sort of seeing the reverence they also have for stone buildings. In this example, this was a building that was rebuilt, renovated. They deconstructed the wall, labeled every single block, and then sort of building by numbers, if you will, sort of reconstructed it. I mean, it's almost as complex as some of Mike's shop drawings. But this was really a sort of wonderful lesson to actually go to a place where the entire country is nearly built out of history, and that history is expressed through the tectonics of stone. While we were there as well, we were able to visit the grave site, which is the next image, of the designers of the fortifications of the old city of Jerusalem, who were summarily executed. So the secret passages through the fortifications would not be revealed. We were genuinely hopeful that the Barnes would not do the same thing to Todd and Billy when we finished the project, and sure enough, Todd's still here. Billy, we're not sure about, but Todd is still here at the very least. And then being over there enabled us to see some of the remarkable work and the textures and craft that comes out of Israel and the West Bank. This is the Supreme Court building by Ada, is it Carmi, Todd, I believe? Yeah, Ada Carmi, sorry, not Ada, which is a kind of extraordinary building on a hill, sort of the way the sun hits it and the textures, I think, well, Todd can sort of speak to how this then evolved some of the ideas about the textures that we're using. So maybe I'll sort of hand it back to you, Todd.
Well, certainly the light's different in Israel. And I'd also say that when you're getting stone that doesn't sit in a freeze-thaw environment, you can use a slightly warmer colored stone. And so the stone that actually comes from Jerusalem, which we know is much more pink than the stone we ultimately could use. So we had already determined that we needed to have a stone that would be robust enough to go through the winters there in Philadelphia. But keep on going, Phil. This is great. Or maybe we're moving on. Yeah, we were able to go actually travel to the quarries, see how it was quarried in the blocks, and we realized that this is actually stone that is virtually everywhere. And then we also knew that there were two different types of stone, a Ramon, they call it Ramon gray and Ramon pink, and the pink flows into the gray flows into the pink. There were generally different characteristics. That's that Ken up there and Bill McDowell and Aileen Roberts. So really, it was actually a great and joyful trip to experience stone in its place, and then to meet the people who actually would be working the stone. This was then to take into I think the next image, Phil, did we go to Bethlehem, where ABC, and we all worked with people who we saw were actually chiseling the stone there in the stone shop. Asked them exactly, whether they could make some patterns for us. The one we see on the lower right is one I asked for, which was something that looked a little like cuneiform writing. The stone as it comes out of the ground is a little softer, and anyway, the surface is easily chipped by a chisel, slightly dented, and this then appeared to be a kind of writing. So it had added a different texture than you could ever have achieved should it be a machine-made, machine-finished stone. Next. Yeah, here are just different textures. I think that largely us in various positions, although not leaning against the wall there, actually putting our hand on the different kinds of finishes that they could make. Now, John, John and Kenny, why don't you step in, because you were there all along and you were critical to this.
I think one thing that's interesting is this particular material, and I think, Phil, you actually said it quite well, there's a tradition and a history of stone, not only stone carving, but the use of stone in Jerusalem area in particular. In fact, there's a mandate that the government has put that anything that's built has to be built out of material from the region when the gold is stone. The city actually has a glow at the end of each day. That reconstruction of that, it's like a processional route that goes to the old city. I think it was a Moshe Safdie, the building with the numbers on it. It just sort of shows you the reverence they have for the use of stone. There was obviously the folks that we work with, they have artisans that are, they have history, and the family is, years and where they learn how to, work with the material. And I think when you look at these textures here, some are combinations, like the one in the middle and the top is a saw cut and then it's split. The one to the right is hand struck. The person in the middle to the right with the hand, that's actually a natural split surface. And then you have other various finishes. I think, and I'm not sure, maybe John, the Tod finish, it was really interesting because we actually put it into the finish because, and I think you were there when that process was being made.
Yeah, the most interesting thing really working with Tod and Billy is the passion and the love they have for the stone. To think about how this all began with 6x6 samples and 6x12 samples, then to have the trip that we made, and just listening to Philip, the way he describes working with them, because you have to find out a lot of things about to source the material, the character of the stone. Can the stone be made in certain sizes through the adaptation of what Tod and Billy drew, the size of the material, the thickness of the material. But the most unique thing on the trip, and we learned this was like a tremendous exterior job for us, on how light absorption that you're looking at, that Tod and Billy had to adjust. You're looking at light in Jerusalem and thinking about how the light is going to be in Philadelphia by changing the finishes on the material, let's say from a honed to a sandblasted to a patina. That was really educational for both Kenny and myself. And you know, the finish that Ken is talking about, Ken actually named it the Tod finish. But to listen to what Tod and Billy were speaking about, we were there to have this finish for the interior, and having a young guy with a hammer and chisel sitting on top of a 4-inch thick slab with a bottle of water and a 7-Up bottle, chiseling and tapping and chiseling and tapping. And at the moment they finished one slab, Tod and Billy just said, "That's it. That's the finish." And it was remarkable to watch this entire product, an entire Barnes Foundation come to life after this small 6x6 sample we started with a year before. And that was the most educational and most exciting experience that I've had. 40 years in the business, second to none, and it was just great being there with both of them. So it shows you have to listen to your client, meaning Tod and Billy, listen to everything they say, and then give them samples. And you saw the mock-up that was done, full-size mock-up. So there wasn't one stone that wasn't, you know, unturned, that they looked at every single aspect, and the job was just spectacular.
Well, I think first I want to say a lot of that's horseshit, but because
no, I don't think so.
Listening to everybody all the time, and it was because we were all there together, whether it's Phil or Billy or Aileen or John or Kenny or Mike. I mean, it really we're given the moniker that we're making the choices. Thank you so much. But honestly, I felt like it emerged naturally. So. Mike, are you going to take over? Please don't blame anything on me. You can blame it on Phil if you want. Mike, you're muted.
Okay, I think I'm on now. So, yeah, Greg, are you giving me control of the mouse?
Yes, you should have control now.
Okay, I'll give it a go. So I think one of the themes that's coming out of all the conversation so far is really the teamwork and collaboration that's gone into a project like this. And, you know, having worked on several projects with various stakeholders, I mean, the drive to a successful project really stems from that, and getting all the stakeholders, and in this case involved right from the onset of the project, to understand the architect's vision, what they're trying to get accomplished. I mean, us from an engineering perspective, we highly respect, you know, the work that architects do. Our job is to make it work. And our challenge is always trying to ensure we keep the architect's intent as much as possible. When you're dealing with natural stone, obviously there's physical characteristics that we have to always worry about, the environment that the stone's going into, which are all key factors on driving some of the decisions that may drive panel size, may drive thickness. And in this case here, you know, the collaboration at the beginning and vetting through all of that, what's feasible, what's not feasible, what's flexible and fluid to accomplishing those goals, I think was really the main thing that drives a successful project. And this for sure is right up there on one of the top ones that we've been involved with. So if I can see if I can advance. So in this case here, I mean, the elevations look quite simple and typical when you look at them, but when you get into it, there's not a lot of typical. I mean, they're all rectangular shapes, which is great to work with. You know, engineers, straight lines is always nice to work with. But the way the panels were designed were isolated assemblies, and we approached it that way. We broke the project down into zones, and in order to track from a fabrication, logistics, installation, I mean, we worked closely, as Phil mentioned, with DM Sabia on their needs on the job site, their needs with logistics. So developing a numbering system that everybody could follow and track each panel where it belongs on the project was very critical, especially when you're shipping from overseas. I mean, you don't want to be shipping stones that are not needed till the end of the project. They have to be shipped in a certain sequence. So by creating zones and numbering everything in that sequence, you're able to control that into a bunch of small little projects, right from the stone supply to the steel fabrication to the anchoring requirements. So breaking it down like that is always a good thing. So here you can see a partial elevation with the stone numbering system. And then followed by that, we did a framing system. So this is everything that's going in behind the stone to anchor the stone to. So, I mean, there's a lot of proprietary systems out there that are, you know, off the shelf aluminum grid systems that you can purchase, which we always like to explore as options. In this case here, the mass of the panels being in many cases 3-inch thick, because you wanted to see the mass of the panel because you see reveals and the edges of the stone. Most of those were not robust enough to carry the stone. So our next step is, how do we engineer something that's simple and practical? So we developed a system with off-the-shelf HSS square tubes anchored back to the structure, and then built an anchoring system off that. And that was the general approach that we took. And
hey, Mike.
Yes.
Just really quickly before you move off the elevation for a second, I also wanted to just note, and this was something that Picco was really helpful in working out with us, and really required a kind of in-depth conversation with the stone fabricator in the West Bank. Budgets are always important, schedule is always important, and I think actually going to the quarry and going to the fabricator shop, we really began to learn the limitations of the stone from a cutting perspective and also from a waste perspective. And so the original design of the elevation, which, you know, again, had this tapestry quality with the reveals that Mike is describing, and then individual pieces forming what we would call super panels. And we were actually, during the bidding process, looking at a unitized system versus a conventionally set system, which is what Picco and Sabia came up with. But there was also the notion of how big could the panels really be, both from a loading perspective and also from a waste perspective, to keep the price down. And so we actually redesigned and just hand marked up numerous elevations to try to get the distribution, the percentages based on waste, to use as much of the stone as possible, which maybe it's not the most sustainable thing to buy stone in Israel and ship it to Philadelphia, but we were trying to be good stewards to the amount of material that we would be using, because it was such a great, strong limestone that had this wonderful character to it. So sorry, I just wanted to interject that relative to how the logic of the panelization came out.
Right. Fantastic point. And we have actually worked on some other projects with architects where they've done exactly that, changed the pattern in order to utilize the stones and the size of the blocks that are being extracted, so you don't get as much waste. So that's a really great way to utilize the stone as much as possible. And that's where, you know, understanding the materials and being somewhat flexible in design and still achieving your goal is great. And that's, you know, the feedback and the collaboration of everybody involved that drives that. So as we move on to the, let's see here, a little delay. I think I'm frozen here. Craig, do you mind trying to advance the slide for me? Oh, now it went too far. Let's see. There we are. Okay, I think it's just a delay. So here you can see that this is basically the framing that we developed, just a square tube offset off the wall so the insulation could pass behind it and anchored back to the structure. So what we wanted to do was bring the steel outside, bring all the steel outboard of the insulation, allow the insulation to pass through, and minimize the amount of penetrations through the insulation to control the thermal bridges going through. So in most cases, the tubes spanned the entire height of each segmental panel and had 2 penetrations. In some odd cases, you can see we had to custom fabricate some tubes around openings and may have had a third penetration too into the backup. But again, another indication, although everything looks typical, there was quite a few custom shapes that had to be accommodated around the building. Here you can see kind of the typical approach of anchoring. Everything in this case, because most of the edges were exposed with the exception of the internal joints within the panels, we couldn't anchor on the perimeter of the panel or at the bottom or top. obviously we didn't want to expose the anchors. So from an installation perspective, this installation does become the most cumbersome because we refer to it as a blind connection. The connection piece, the connection anchor has to be set and the panels have to drop in place. You don't really have much adjustment because the anchors are all what we call blind. They're behind the panels. So a lot of input with DM Sabia, the installer, on how they wanted to approach that and what our options were to make it as efficient as possible. And this was one we came up with a pocket kerf, which we pocketed out the back for the load bearing, typical at the interior joints of the panel. And then obviously we had a lot of special conditions to deal with. We had some roller shutters. So in this case, we had special connections to anchor little soffit pieces. There were also reveals in there that we had to ensure all our anchors were away from the reveals and allowed enough space. And again, understanding all these requirements early on really helps us drive our approach in our anchoring system. Not knowing a lot of these early enough could obviously drive us down the wrong path and have to accommodate later. So the more collaboration, more information we have earlier on, we can also have impact to assist the structural engineers on what requirements we may need. So being involved early enough, we can also benefit the project from that perspective, other than dealing with stuff downstream where it's almost too late to do it. So the earlier we can be involved as one of the stakeholders and input that, I mean, it just makes things a lot smoother moving forward. Here again, just some special anchors. Here we call, I mean, these are T-bolts, which are anchors that go into the back of the stone and anchor in. Again, special conditions. We have copings to deal with. So again, although, you know, from the surface, everything looks quite typical, when you get behind it and how you have to fasten it and anchor it, there's a lot more complexities involved a lot of times. So here are some of the anchors that we had to deal with. We had these fins that created shadow lines, and these were all dealt with independently. We had a separate tube behind each one of these, and they were all anchored independently. Again, a pretty simple connection, but again, being blind, so all the anchors dropped in and fastened in. DM Sabia was great to work with. A lot of collaboration, a lot of meetings with them on the approach on various areas. And I think they did a fantastic job executing the installation as well. Here again, just some other approaches on how we deal with these blind connections. On the left, you could see it's just a lateral tie back at the top. So it's a clip that slides in, anchors the stone at the top. And again, another blow up of the soffit connection. You can see here on the left side, we're using a self-tapping screw. So just drilling into the tube with self-tapping, self-drilling screws because the loads are not that high. In the other case on the right, the more robust anchor because it needs to carry much higher load. It needs to carry the dead load of the stone. So various anchors, again, from the outside looks very typical. When you get in behind, there's different complexities and different conditions. Sometimes we'll just piggyback a piece of stone onto the adjacent stone. So you see on the left, all we did was anchor the return to the adjacent stone, and that became part of the installation. So no special anchors required other than fastening the two stones. On the right side, we have a thinner stone application here that I believe this stone is 1 and 2. This was a load-bearing connection. Again, a blind connection at the back, but rather than slotting into the stone, we fastened a back of it that locks into the load-bearing connection. So a lot of technical information here, but just wanted to cover some of the various conditions that we have to deal with as structural engineers on how to fasten the stone. And obviously, the more complex the job, the various conditions we have to deal with, which really is the importance of getting involved earlier on the project to really work with the various people involved. Here you can see a photo of the installation. You can see all the vertical tubes in place, and you can see the insulation running behind them, and the two penetrations, one top and bottom. So we're minimizing the thermal bridging, and that's really an important aspect when we're dealing with several panels like that. I mean, we did look at an approach of independent anchors, but that would require penetrating through at every joint, at every panel, 2 locations. And this way, you know, we really limited that from a thermal bridging perspective. I think it was a very effective approach. And here you can see during the installation of the job, during construction, you can see a lot of the panels on the ground there, and they were all tracked and monitored so they could be shipped and located on the job site where they needed to be without moving them around too much. And that really, again, is a collaboration with fabricators, installers, and logistics on the job site with the GC on what the sequence of construction is, because sequence could go vertical up in sections, or it could run around the building in different layers. So really understanding the sequence of the installation will really drive how we order the material and how we ship it to the job site. So again, understanding all that is extremely important to really driving the logistics on the job site and the efficiency. So I think that pretty much wraps up my part of the presentation. I just want to thank everybody involved here and those that aren't present as well on a really enjoyable project. And, you know, I think the final photos speak for themselves. It's just a fantastic job to be involved with. So thank you to all of you for giving us the opportunity to be part of it.
And thank you, Mike. I mean, he started out by saying how critical collaboration is, and it absolutely is. And although I think Billy and I get too much credit for this project, that's part of the story, I suppose. But I actually do believe that the true story beneath the story is that we're always listening to one another and respecting one another. And if you can do that and have an idea of where you're going, other people will help you to get there. So it's really been, these are all people who have become friends and collaborators, and hope we can do it again. It's a magical thing when we can, when it all works like this, but it's only collaboration. So thank you. I think that there's some time for questions. I have no idea whether there are questions. Can anyone tell me whether people want to send in questions, and we'll see if we can.
Greg, I think there's also some final photos. Greg, if you want to take over and.
Yeah, Greg, take over, please. Or you want me to take over? Okay. Yeah, no, the cool and the warm was something we were very interested in. And in the exterior of the building, we use this Ramon gray. You can see the orange spot there means that it's a weaker area of the stone, and we use more of the Ramon gold, which is the more orange stone, on interior spaces that were not subject to ice and cold. Next image, I guess this may be the last one, which is that it's kind of horizontal, a luminous building in what is ultimately a vertical city, but it's trying to really be part of and yet separate from the buildings that are on the parkway. And I think that's the last one. Is that correct? I'm going to push the button and see. Oh no, here. Oh, this, we wanted to talk about this. Actually, this is a fun little story, which is that the mosaics were made in Long Island City, as I recall. John, you found someone that makes mosaics by cutting up these small pieces of stone, and worked with a drawing that Billy had made inspired by a liar's cloth or an African cloth. So on the right hand side, you see the cuneiform stone, which we tried to make a kind of liner on the interior of the building. As you got closer, we would use that more refined technique on a place where people might come into closer contact with the building than the exterior. What else have we got? That may be it. I'm pushing the forward button. And Greg, are you there? I think that is it then, because my button doesn't push anymore. At any rate, we're happy to take questions. Are there? Oh, here. There's there's Billy's drawing on the left, and the liar's cloth mosaic. It's wonderful because we both believe in mistakes. It's not a perfect drawing on the left, nor is it a perfect stone setting job on the right, but the imperfection itself brings a kind of sense of perfection, that there's a person behind this. And we believe that just as we're 5 of us here talking today, every person counts. So the stone setter here was absolutely crucial. We're trying to mix materials in here. On the far right is concrete. We knew that concrete play a role, so certainly we thought about the stone in terms of what it would look like in terms of the concrete, or the concrete aggregate choice in relationship to the stone. It's been a very, very successful surface. And then we used it on the light court. You can see we used a warmer stone that would not have been so appropriate outside. It has more pink and orange in it. It's slightly softer. And here we asked our dear friend, the felt artist working with her wool and her silk, wool from her sheep, to create silk panels that would absorb sound in the light court that felt like they were a play on the stone. So that it came in response to the stone and in a location where people's voices needed to be absorbed. Obviously, light raking the stone is fantastic. And then I think this is also played Aileen Roberts, who said, you know, you really need to make sure this has a warm, soft feeling, and that it's not cold. So we were constantly trying to play the idea of cool against warm. And that was a dialogue we had from beginning to end. And we felt very, very important that the stone came in, and in some places it was set against, in this case, a linen surface that could be used as a pin surface, and the wood windows were essential to this. And here we see on the main gallery, remaking of the gallery, we do see that Tennessee pink on the floor, and actually a Jura stone on the perimeter. So it's not one stone, but it's a number of stones. But largely the primary stone was the stone from the Negev, the Ramon gray and the Ramon gold.
Hey Todd,
Todd, I was just going to sort of. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a couple of questions that also we have. Phil, why don't you make your point, and then we can kind of open up a couple of the questions that are being asked by the audience.
Yeah, just real quick. I mean, the image of the light court that Todd was just showing, and the Aileen Roberts sort of pushing us to do something really warm and have the space feel really present. I mean, what's fascinating, I think, about the building as well is Todd and Billy really did conceive it as 2 buildings. I mean, it is technically one building with, you know, one mechanical system and one structure and all that kind of stuff. But the light court is really intended to be this outdoor space. And so it required a lot of buy-in, frankly, from a client to essentially pay to wrap the inside of their building in an exterior wall to reinforce this notion that you enter what we call the pavilion, which is where you would shed your jacket and use the restroom and buy a cup of coffee. And then you would exit the building into the light court, which was capped with this amazing clear story that would bring in diffuse light that would feel like the light that you came outside from. And then you would re-enter the gallery building. And it was a kind of remarkable, it was a very clear gesture that I think really reinforced also the original experience of being out in Marion, that you would enter the gallery and then very, very shortly in front of you would be art. And we were trying to recreate that idea as well. So anyway, sorry, Greg, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, so I'll just relate some of the questions that have been asked, one of which is from Jonathan Tibbett. A few questions from him, but the first one, why does the prestigious Mr. Tod Williams have an alias, and is he hiding from the law? I can actually answer that question, which is that it is a technical snafu on our part. So he is posing as me. I'm trying to take as much credit as I can from his words. But another question that he asks is, on many of Williams and Chen's facades, they have the level of sensitivity of using the material's full color range and adopting the stone for its natural beauty. Many architects try to cull the stone in such a way that it limits its use and create tremendous waste and angst for all participants. Can Todd share where this sensitivity in his facade started and came to be?
Maybe it came by working for 7 years with Richard Meyer, and realizing when I went out on my own that I really thought I was following his dictums, but I found that I was not happy in that world, and that I wanted something that felt more open. And probably it also came from working with Billy, where we are interested in interiors and warmth and change and the sort of sense of a larger family of humanity. So I do think it's a natural thing. We also had clients who want the stone to be absolutely perfect, and the longer I've worked, the more I believe that the full range of the stone, provided it has the durability that is required, is critical. And I will say here, working with someone like ABC, the issue of inclusions in stone, to me, I love inclusions, but an inclusion that is not durable for the use or might be subject to cleaning materials that attack it can screw up a job completely. So you have to be very careful not to say any stone, any piece of the stone. You have to have somebody that knows where they're getting the stone. I've always said that the farmer, the person who owns the quarry, is the person who best knows his stone. Talk to him and say, we need the best stone you've got, and he will generally direct you to the best area of the quarry for a particular use. So it's just time, John, and I thank you for that.
So another question, this is from Martin Finio. Hello, Martin. The super panels are presumably made up of smaller stone pieces. How are those pieces put together to form the super panel? What is the substrate that they are adhered to?
Interesting. Phil, will you take that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, to kind of maybe tack onto what Mike was introducing, it was that we called it a rail system. Forgive me, Mike, if that's not technically quite there. And I will say, during the pre-construction, Driscoll was brought on board. They brought in Sabia and Picco to help us as architects, you know, price, schedule, and conceive of that backup system. And so while we always knew we were going to float the panels off the wall to get good thermal and insulative capacity, it was really a challenge to think about, okay, well, we're going to wrap the building in an air and vapor barrier, and then we're going to just punch all these holes in it and turn it into Swiss cheese. And it was Sabia that came forward and said, look, if we just do these 2 rails per, we'll say, column of stone, you'll notice that the vertical joints between stones are always up and down. It's the horizontal ones that vary position. And so that allowed them to do pairings of rails for sort of each column. And then, as Mike was saying, you know, they could do conventional anchor points preset for certain types of anchors, and then everything else would have to be field fastened to create the blind hung conditions. And that hot dipped galvanized system then just had 4 legs that were then attached to a grout-filled CMU backup that had thermal isolators. So we now just had essentially 2, 4, 6, 8. We'd have 8 fasteners through the air and vapor barrier per say 4 pieces of stone. So it was a kind of brilliant system. And I got to be honest, like Driscoll didn't think it would work from a schedule perspective, but actually Sabia and Picco were able to show that they could do a conventionally set facade system this way as fast as a unitized system that would have required a lot more equipment. Sorry, Todd, go ahead.
And it definitely was not the way we thought of the project. We imagined, Martin, that the project would be entirely wrapped in a stainless steel skin. That would be the thing that would shed the water as a rain screen, and that someone would make these panels off-site and bring them up and drop them on. Now, I guess that can be done with precast panels today, but I can tell you it would be a problem to get this to look this way. So it definitely came from Sabia and Picco, I think, and Phil's dogged following through on all of this.
Question for Mike, also from Martin, is the blind connection seems to eat very deeply into the stone. This doesn't undermine the stone itself, question mark. So this could be for Mike, Ken, John, any of you that want to kind of chime in here.
Sure, I can go. Maybe you can go back to that connection if you can go back a few slides. Back. Right there. Yeah, so in this case here, you have to understand that that's just a local pocket. So that would maybe only be about 6 or 8 inches wide. You're not taking away, it's not like a continuous channel across there. So they're local pockets, the width of the anchor. We need to go in that deep to bear enough of the stone on the anchor because the size of some of the panels. So we typically like to bear 2/3 of the stone on the anchor and 1/3 projecting out. and that's what we did there. And I mean, we did checks on the properties of the stone. That would be filled with a sealant, so there would be a little bit of a cushion between the metal and the stone there in order not to induce stresses. We always like to leave a little bit of space beyond the steel to allow for a little bit of differential movement between the steel and the stone. So, I mean, the intent is always to create a little bit of a cushion between metal components and stone as much as possible.
I mean, my idea is always to use the thickest stone possible, and that makes it heavy. And then, of course, not to channel it out. So that milling out must be expensive, Mike. Milling out these pockets, is that complex and expensive to do?
It used to be way more. I mean, now with a lot of the CNC equipment that they have, a lot of the fabricators, it's become more economical. So we used to do these at the ends of the stone primarily, so they could work from the end. But when it's inboard now, you're right, it requires milling out, but it has become more economical, more accepted in the industry now with the newer technology available. So it used to be a real big challenge when we requested something like this. Now not so much.
Actually, that blind pocket, there's an interesting story behind that. Sammy at the factory looked at that and said, I don't know what that is. They don't traditionally do mechanical fasten facades in Israel. So he actually had to develop sort of a two-process machine that would once carve that sort of, like you said, the localized pocket, and then another tool that would do that up part so that the clip would rest on that. And it would cause a little panic for a couple of days, but he figured it out. And I don't think anyone was aware, but it was a bit of a challenge that we overcame.
Yeah.
Okay, another question for you, Ken, from Jonathan. For Ken, what is the status of the Jerusalem quarry today?
The Jerusalem quarry is currently closed. We have 500 cubic meters of material in a yard in Jerusalem, and we've been burning that material on projects. We actually have probably a 6-year store of the material for the projects based on the current use per year. We actually controlled the quarry for 3 years, and then more recently it has closed because of environmental issues. The thought is that they'll probably reopen it at some point. It's not that the stone is causing an environmental problem, but it's in an area that is well controlled by the government, and it's something in the future may change the thought, because generally it's operating and then it's closed and then it operates and closed. So we had it for the last 3 years, and we've got an ample store, but there is, like everything, a finite amount of material available.
Okay, I think that concludes the question. There was one question from Louise Corso that asked about if you were able to transfer any skills learned while at Richard Meyer's studio, Todd, on this particular project, which I believe that you may have answered, but if you want to elaborate any further, but that'll be the last question.
Yeah.
And we
well, no, look, it was a great training ground for me, and I've often said I should have stayed longer because it was so green when I left. But I think Richard's sense of rigor was something that I hadn't experienced before. I was just a kid from the Midwest and didn't know how to work hard. And I learned how to work hard, and I knew how to be precise. But there wasn't as much exploration as I wanted there. And I won't talk about the work environment because, frankly, I was a happy person, although spending way too much time in the studio. But everyone does that. Phil did it. We all did it. Anyway, thank you all. I think this was simply a great. When I was asked to do this, I immediately said yes. Said let's bring in Phil. I certainly couldn't do it myself. We certainly couldn't do any of this without the team of people we've just been talking to, and and so many others. It's just so I hope and I'm sure we're able to find ways to answer questions, particularly technical questions, to direct them to Mike or Ken or John, even Phil. I'm sure would be happy to do that. I would say I know very little, but I'm happy to also answer questions.
Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Take care.